today we're going to put a finer point on that and talk about sensory integration therapy or treatment. This is something you're going to be hearing more and more about if you haven't started hearing about it already. So let's take a look at what our actual definition is. Sensory integration therapy, it's treatment and therapy that provides stimulation of vestibular, proprioceptive, and tactile senses. Love jargon, right? Because they just give you more jargon. So we're going to talk about these three things: vestibular, proprioceptive, and tactile senses, because a lot of people get confused and go, oh, well, sensory integration therapy, isn't that all rolled into my OT? Sometimes you will come across OTs that are working on things in these three categories, but I think sensory integration therapy, we're looking at this and it's a much more specific thing where they're only working on those things. Let's take a look at our working definition. Sensory integration therapy, it's therapy and treatment that seeks to improve the brain's ability to process and organize sensations. So we're not gonna, with an OT, you're going to see kids who are doing, the push pin to try to build their pincer grasp, and they're going to work on gross motor things. There might be things that are crossover, but we're working on it on a very specific way. So let's go back to what's a vestibular sense in our actual definition. Vestibular is that you're thinking about the inner ear and our ability to balance and make sense. And when you think about the level that is in our heads that is constantly working and correcting for us to be able to walk in a straight line, for us to be able to sit, stand, run, and maintain balance. If you've ever had any kind of vestibular dysfunction at all, you really begin to understand how much is at play in that inner ear and keeping us moving. I have had, I'm somebody who suffers from vertigo and have had some inner ear issues with a slight problem with Meniere's disease, where your inner ear, you form crystals. Oh my gosh, how I hope that never happens to me again, because you can't even walk in a straight line. You look like you're a little bit drunk. The room spins. Oh my goodness. By the way, if you're having issues with that, there's a series of exercises that they've discovered. You don't have to be treated medically. There's a whole series of things that you can do, either have somebody else do where you lean back and they tilt your head a certain way. You can find them online. You can do it yourself. What a difference it can make for a lot of people who suffer from that kind of issue. But for our kids on the autism spectrum, if they are having an inner ear imbalance, we will see sometimes our kids have a lower ability to handle things vestibular, or sometimes they crave that. So our kids that we see spin constantly, and then sometimes speak better after they spin, they crave that particular kind of sensation. We don't exactly know why yet, but it's great to know where your kid is on that line of are they oversensitive or undersensitive in terms of vestibular sense. I am completely oversensitive. You put me on a stationary bicycle and I'm car sick for a week. I'm not kidding. But my child, he did the astronaut training, which is all about vestibular senses, where they put them on essentially a turntable and they spin them a certain number of times in one direction in one position, and then they spin them the other way in a certain number of times and there's a series of exercises that they do changing their positions. It takes like 10 minutes to do it, but for kids who are underactive in terms of vestibular, a lot of times it awakens the sense that allows them to speak. I don't know why, but I have watched as they have put kids that I have seen not be able to say a sound, do the astronaut training, and that's literally what they call it, astronaut training, do the whole thing, and the child sits up and says a sentence. It's amazing. We used to take my son to Disneyland and send him on the teacups, and he could speak better after being on the teacups because he's one of those kids. He has to go with dad because mom can't do it. He'd be speaking and I would be over in a gutter throwing up. Okay, so that's vestibular. Then we talk about proprioceptive. This is a whole area that's absolutely fascinating in the world of autism. Proprioceptive is your ability to know where your body is in space and time and keep track of it with your brain without having visual sense on it. So if you can walk upstairs without looking at your feet, you're using your proprioceptive sense. A lot of our kids on the autism spectrum have issues proprioceptively. They require stimulation to know where their arm is in space. We use the term disintegrate, and we see kids have meltdowns, and we have used the expression, oh, they just disintegrated in front of me. But the truth of it is that's actually what we're talking about. They disintegrate. When our proprioceptive is working well, we are completely integrated. We know where we are in space. We may not be totally conscious of it all the time, but I know where my feet is. I know where my hands are in space. You know that moment when you're sitting someplace and you doze off and you jolt awake and you kind of have to grasp something because you don't know where you are in space and how disconcerting that moment is? That's what it's like for some of our kids on the autism spectrum on a regular basis. So for some kids, brushing them with a dry brush helps them to be aware of, okay, that's where my arm is, and helps their brain to be stimulated to know. So when I'm looking at somebody and taking notes, that I know my hand is here. For other kids, it can be pressure, squeezing, burrito, that kind of thing that can help them to awaken that sense, and everything in between, right? Really, really interesting place of study. And if you've got a child who doesn't seem to be aware of and is bumping into things, this is something really to be looked at. And then, of course, tactile, which I think is the sense that we're all aware of. What does it feel like? We've got kids who are hypersensitive in terms of tactile, that a scratchy tag or scratchy clothes are going to drive them crazy, right? But then there are kids on the opposite end of that spectrum who can't feel things for whatever reason, where they're a little bit numb to things, and they're more likely to get injured because they might touch something that's hot and they don't feel it. So a really interesting area of study, and interesting to see how when we work on things sensory-wise, what that can do for our kids. Now, there is an additional component to this too that isn't listed here that a lot of people are looking into, which is sensory in terms of smell. So we're going to be talking about that in just a moment. But sensory integration therapy, it's a hot new thing, and people are finding that if you find precisely where the child needs help integrating their senses and work on that, that it can help them with that third area of the restrictive and repetitive things that qualify them for the diagnosis. It can help them to deal with what's happening around them, help to prevent them from having meltdowns, and help them to be able to contact and communicate with the world around them. Very interesting area of study.